and I'm a postdoctorate fellow in the project. And now in the project, we usually examine translations into Jewish languages, meaning Hebrew, Yiddish, Ladino, Judeo-Italian, from the early modern period, meaning the 16th, the 17th, the 18th, maybe the early 19th centuries. But today we are going out a little bit out of our early modern comfort zone into the 21st century. As we will see today, I hope, we have many interesting connections between the early modern Jewish translations and modern Yiddish translations, and especially this great Harry Potter translation that we will dedicate almost the entire evening to discuss it. And right now it's a great opportunity to say that in the chat you'll find two important links. The first link is a link with information about our group and our activities. And the second link, which is maybe even more important, is a link with details of how to buy the book if you would like to buy it and have it in your bookshelf. So we hope to think together about questions regarding Jewish translation in general. What makes a translation Jewish? Is a Yiddish translation necessarily a Jewish translation? And what are the uses of Jewish translations, and who are the readers of such translations, especially modern 21st translation into Yiddish? So without any long introductions, I'm happy to invite Professor Iris Siderson-Schein, an associate professor in the Department of Jewish History at the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. She is the PI of our project, meaning she's our manager, our boss of the project, and she will say a few words. Iris.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. Hi, everyone. We have a very rich and interesting, exciting program this evening, so I'm not going to take up too much time with lengthy introductions. I do want to thank our guest, Arun Viswanath, for joining us today to talk about Harry Potter in Yiddish. I want to thank Dolsal Mann, who'll be offering some concluding remarks. And I want to thank the JUTAC team, and especially Ronnie Cohen and Osnat Sharon Pinto for organizing this wonderful event. Thank you so much. Ronnie's already introduced the project. I'll just echo his recommendation that you visit the site and also do sign up to our newsletter at www.jutact.com. We have many events that have been recorded. This event is being recorded as well. All our articles are available in open access, and you'll be able to follow our activities. And without further ado, let me return the virtual microphone back to Ronnie.
Thank you very much, Iris. So we wanted that our evening will include a few points of discussions about the relationships between early modern Jewish translations, the things that we try to do to study every day in the office, and the work of Arun. So right now we will have two short presentations that will suggest two possible viewpoints on Jewish translation. So first, we have Dr. Osnat Sharon Pinto. Osnat Sharon Pinto is a postdoctoral researcher at the JUTAC team, and she is a scholar of early modern Jewish literature and cultural history. It is important to say that she is also the main organizer of this entire event. So thank you, Osnat. Shkoyech. And she will talk with us about translating early modern fantasy.
Thank you, Oni. I'll just share my screen. So one moment, please. Okay. Can everybody see the PowerPoint? Is that okay? Okay.
Yes.
So, good. So in this short talk, I want to tell you all about fantasy literature in Yiddish in the early modern period. And the idea is that you get an idea of what Jewish translation was like, and how Harry Potter in Yiddish might be different from, and sometimes very similar to, projects that Jewish translators were up to hundreds of years ago. So first of all, when we talk about the early modern period, historians can mean all kinds of things, but for our purposes, we're talking about the mid 15th century through early 19th century. So very roughly from the invention of print, more or less, and up until about 200 years ago. And the first thing you need to know about translated fantasy literature at the time is that it was extremely popular with Jews, and that this was happening mostly in Yiddish for two reasons. One was that only some Jews knew proper Hebrew, mostly the ones who could afford an education and were male, and everyone else in Central and Eastern Europe, or everyone else who was Jewish, spoke Yiddish. So Yiddish was more marketable. The other reason was that when you translate things into a language that isn't the holy tongue, you can be a little more relaxed about the sort of frivolous content that you're bringing in. Now, I'm talking mainly about a genre called chivalric romance, Roman Abirim in Hebrew. Now, chivalric romance is generally a story about the heroic deeds of a medieval knight. So you know this from culture. It generally revolves around themes of loyalty, honor, courtly love, and typically the knight travels the land and has hair-raising adventures. He kills dragons, he fends off giants, he wages war against Muslims, and he saves a whole bunch of damsels in distress. And the bit I want to read for you is an excerpt from the lovely Bovodantona. Bovodantona, or Sir Bevis of Hampton, is a chivalric romance that was translated into Yiddish in the 16th century by the Jewish Renaissance man Eliyahu Levite, also known as Elia Bocher or Eliyahu Bechur. And in this little bit I'm going to read, the brave Bovo battles Pelukan. Pelukan is a fearsome warrior with the head of a dog, like the little guy in the picture that I put in here. And I will be reading just this one bit in Yiddish because I want you to hear the rhyming and the rhythm. So, Bovo sprach, nun lass dir derweil, ich will dir wohl anderes weisen. Ich furcht mich nicht vor deinen Pfeil, noch vor ihren scharfen Eisen. Do sprang Pelukan hinter sich in Eil, ein Sprung, der was wohl zu preisen, und flugs ein noch dem anderen herausgezogen und schoss auf Bovo mit seinem Bogen. So you can already see and hear that this is old Yiddish, right? This is quite different from modern Yiddish, and it's certainly spelled very differently. Und do nun kein Pfeil mein het, do zog sein Schwert aus der Scheiden, do luft sie miteinander in die Weit und schlugen aufeinander mit Freuden. Now, you can see that a lot of weapons are employed in this bit, as well as a lot of verbal bravado, and also really just a lot of joyousness, both in the story and in the storytelling. By the way, if you're wondering about how this particular battle ended, then let me tell you that these two ended up being best buddies. Now, one feature of these works is that they are very decidedly not quote unquote Jewish. They were originally created outside the Jewish cultural linguistic sphere. They feature heroes who cannot be Jewish because in the medieval order, Jews can't be knights. It's not their place within the system. Also, chivalric romance reflects a world of values and ideas which really doesn't fit naturally with Jewish schemes. The knight is out to serve his king and to prove his valor and manliness and to procure a wife through sometimes unseemly means, and to sometimes even partake of adventures which are crusader-ish. So it's quite striking that these stories were so very popular. Now, we have a couple of ways for knowing they were popular. One is that they were translated, copied, and reprinted all over the place for centuries. The other is that they were often complained about and warned against by upstanding members of society. And one thing any historian will tell you is that the more warnings, lectures, even legislation you see in written sources against any given thing, the more wildly popular it must have been. Now, the second thing I want to tell you about is fantastic beasts. So, as many of you probably know, magical beasts of all sorts can be found in Jewish lore from ancient times through the Middle Ages and onwards. And I want to tell you about the cultural translation of a dragon story, the fearsome Lindwurm of Worms. Worms in Germany, also known in the Jewish world as Vermeisa, is home to one of the most ancient Jewish communities in Central Europe. And the early modern Jews of Worms felt some considerable local pride over this fact. So we have a beautiful late 17th century story collection by a Worms local called Yus Pashames, which contains 25 local stories, purportedly ancient ones, and it's meant to serve as a kind of Jewish history of the place. And the book is called Sefer Ma'aseh Nisim, and true to its name, the stories are full of wonders and miracles. And many of the stories are very purposeful about establishing the community's ancient local origins. Supposedly, the Jews had been in Worms since the destruction of the first temple, no less. The book is also very invested in presenting the Jewish community's deep belonging to the city and their camaraderie with local Christians. So it may come as no surprise when, among stories of local strife and neighborly cooperation, and also some Worms-born Jewish celebrities, Shamitz presents the story of how the city fended off a dragon, or Lindwurm. So let's just read the description of the fearsome beast. I will have pity on you and read this one in English. In old times, the town of Worms was very big, and a dragon came flying and lay by the city walls and caused great harm. It had destroyed many houses and swallowed many people and animals. It destroyed everything it touched. The dragon was terribly big and had 2 legs and looked from behind like a worm and a snake, but was much thicker and larger, and it had eyes that shone like fire and a mouth full of terrible teeth. Now, the storyteller goes on to say that perhaps it might have been possible to kill the dragon with a gun, but guns hadn't been invented yet. And this is fun, and it also seems to indicate that the storyteller considered the story to be real. Now, finally, a giant takes on the dragon. The giant is swallowed whole by the dragon, and he cuts his way out. The giant is then crowned king of the city, which is named Worms in commemoration of the event. Now, my point here is that by telling this dragon story in the context of this book, the Jews are identifying with the local lore of Worms and making a statement about their local identity. The last thing I want to talk to you about is about the Jewish history of the wizard's duel. The wizard's duel is actually a popular trope that comes up in original Jewish stories, most commonly in the many versions of the story Ma'aseh Akdamut, which is a story about a dark wizard or priest that threatens to destroy a local community and challenges them to a duel. The community sends an emissary to the land of the 10 lost tribes of Israel beyond the mythical Sambatyon River. The 10 tribes are, of course, happy to help their brethren, and they send a powerful wizard of their own, and a dramatic face-off ensues. Spoiler, the Jews always win. However, the excerpt I'd like to read comes from a different story. This story, the tale of the fisher's son, Ein schöne wunderliche Historie von ein Fischer und sein Sohn, is a late 18th century story, and it's actually a version of an international fairy tale. You can find it in the Grimm Brothers collection, for example. And it's about a boy who is promised to a demon in a bargain. The boy defeats the demon and goes on to have many adventures. Except our version of the story has some singular details. And I will read this in English again. So the fisher's son said to the king, "Beloved king, the only way to help me is to get me a master who might teach me the art of overpowering the ghosts in hell." The king sent for the greatest dark wizard, who was very learned in the godly writings in which one may evoke higher powers. So this is using the names of God to do magic. This is, of course, a very Jewish form of magic. The wizard came to the king's court and was introduced to his young student. Afterwards, the master took him under his power, and they were locked in a separate room for 4 weeks. After these 4 weeks, the master left him hanging in midair for 3 days. Afterwards, they were locked in the room for another 6 months. When this year had gone by, the master came with his student before the king to present their progress. An eagle came flying into the court. The student gave a shout. The shout caused the eagle to fall before the student's feet. He hung a millstone, a very heavy stone, from its feet and had it fly with it. The eagle achieved this as if it was a strand of straw. The fisher's son was a wizard, the likes of which could not be found in that kingdom and many others. So the thing is, apparently in no other version of the story does the child stave off the demon by becoming a magician. So this whole segment of wizarding education, etc., is apparently entirely Jewish. So why does it show up? Well, I chose this story to help me demonstrate how the wizard's dual motif can end up serving Jewish translation in the face of Christian motifs that need some tweaking for a Jewish audience, what in research we call Judaization of a story. You see, the closest version to ours is an Italian one, and there the boy fights off the demon by making the sign of the cross. In other versions, we have him doing an apprenticeship with a priest. So these plot points would obviously be unpalatable for a Jewish audience, so instead we're treated to the lengthy instruction of magic culminating in a dramatic battle. So to sum up, it appears that Jews, much like their European neighbors, were enchanted with stories of magic and high adventure, and they even used magical motifs to alternately position themselves as close to or distinct from the majority culture surrounding them. In translating fantasy stories, they brought new and exciting content into their worlds and made that content their own in the process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asnat. I have to admit that I'm still waiting for the Netflix adaptation of Bova Diantona, Bimera B'Yamenu. So one of the main questions regarding the modern Yiddish translations of Harry Potter that came out when we thought about this event is what it is like to translate into a language that many people use as a second language, meaning they can read the same text in English, Hebrew, French, German in a way that maybe will be even more accessible to them. So Mr. Auvia Goren, our next speaker, will suggest an early modern take to this phenomenon of translating into a less spoken language in a way. Auvia Goren is a doctoral student.
Translations. Honestly, I am not so sure, but I learned it's hard to say no to an enthusiastic Ronnie, so let's give it a try. In the 16th century, the philosopher Girolamo Cardano wrote that Jews, too, have the language of the region they inhabit and their own, which is Hebrew, and we have Italian, distinct from Latin. He compares Hebrew to Latin for obvious and good reasons. Both were ancient international languages used mostly by elites. As Cardano noticed, Jews communicated mostly by speaking in local vernaculars, although they had Hebrew, which was considered their own language. Cardano's remark seems simplistic to those who look into the cases of Yiddish, Ladino, and Judeo-Arabic, as these are placed by different scholars in different places in the middle between a completely separate Jewish language and forms of local dialects. And this is the last word I want to say about this in a Zoom room full of Yiddish scholars. However, in the context of Jewish Italy, it somehow makes sense. Most scholars are convinced that by Cardano's time, the 16th century, Italian Jews had good command of the Italian used by their neighbors. This can be shown by looking at translation of Sidurim and other religious texts. There's a vast amount of translations from Hebrew to spoken Italian as the language Italian Jews understood best. Also, we know that by the 16th century, many or even most Jewish sermons in Italy were given in Italian. Not in Hebrew and not in Judeo-Italian, Italian that Jewish Italians could understand, that non-Jewish Italians could understand. In other words, while Ashkenazi communities had Yiddish as a Jewish language that was different from German and could be used by Jews who did not understand Hebrew, Italian Jews mostly moved between the two, Hebrew and Italian. In our project, we found many translations from Italian into Hebrew. From what we just said, the question immediately rises. Why? Why translate from a language everyone can read to a language only the elites can read? This question was asked also regarding the no few translations from vernacular into Latin in the early modern period. A notable study addressing this question by Peter Burke explained the phenomena.
Oh, yeah, we're seeing this in presentation mode. We're not actually seeing.
Yeah, okay. Sorry. Yeah, this is better, I guess. So Peter Burke
it's still the same. We're still seeing the PowerPoint. We're not actually seeing the presentation. So if you go through the slides, we're not seeing anything.
Okay. I don't know how to solve that.
Do you want to stop sharing and then just reshare the screen?
Yeah, I'll just reshare everything. Sorry for the mess. How's this?
Nope.
I think you should go into a presentation. Stop sharing for a minute.
Okay.
Go to presentation mode and then share the presentation mode, not your own. Yeah.
Oh, wait. No, but this won't work. I don't know what my computer.
Yes, that's okay. Like that also, it's great.
You can just press F5. Oh yeah, you can press F5 and it's presented. If you just press
again?
If you just press F5, it should present it.
Is that working?
No. Just we'll do it like that. That's okay.
Okay, yeah, let's go. So Peter Burke explained this phenomena, arguing that, and I quote, the number of these translations testifies not only to the widespread knowledge of Latin at this time, but also to the fact that many educated people outside frontier regions found foreign vernaculars difficult, if not impossible, to read. While many works translated from German and French into Hebrew in the early modern period can be explained similarly as done also for enlarging the readership, this explanation will not work from many works translated by Italian Jews. Let's look at two examples. In the late 17th century, Rabbi Yehuda Bariel translated many of Seneca's letters from Italian into Hebrew. Around the same time, Samson Molpolgo and Rafael Vitello each translated the fables of Aesop as a bestseller of the time from the 1580 edition prepared by Giulio Landi. Why did they translate into Hebrew while the readers could understand the text of the edition they were using? In the remaining time, I will suggest some possible answers. One simple answer has to do with educational reasons. Hebrew was used for religious studies, and like Latin and ancient Greek at the time, and even today, as the translations of Harry Potter exemplify, was practiced by reading simple or well-known texts in the learned language. The work Over LaSocher, the translation of the simple Treviso arithmetic book of 1478 from Italian into Hebrew in the early 17th century, is only one example for this phenomenon. Another possible answer is what might be called gatekeeping, the attempt to give quote-unquote kosher versions or adapted versions that are more in line with Jewish points of interest and cultural concerns. This does not explain the case of Aesop fables, which were translated faithfully with no noticeable alterations, but could maybe explain Rabbi Bariel's version of Seneca's letters, which omits mentions of Roman gods and some sentences dealing with sexuality. Another possible explanation is the theological significance of Hebrew. We know that some rabbis, especially Kabbalists, saw Hebrew text as having a special theological power. There are even halachic opinions that ruled that material that is not allowed to be read on Shabbat because of its worldliness is permitted if it's written in Hebrew. Bariel, the translator of Seneca into Hebrew, had posted a sign on the door of his yeshiva in Mantua stating that in this room it is only permitted to speak Hebrew. It is possible that he wanted his students to do even their secular readings, and they did quite a lot of secular readings, as he did in Hebrew. Finally, another suggestion has to do with the idea of the Jewish faith living through the enduring of Hebrew. That is, translating for cultural reasons, for preserving a Jewish Hebrew bookshelf. Many Jewish Italian thinkers from the early modern period lamented the forgetting of the Hebrew language by Jewish communities and described it as a grave danger for the continuity of the Jewish people. The 18th century scholar Ephraim Avramini wrote in his introduction to two secular Hebrew dramas that I call these works Chulin shenesu al ta'arat HaKodesh, which means a secular thing that is based on holiness, because just as works like this are banned in the languages of the Gentiles, so they are welcome when they are in Hebrew, as they save us from evil and relate the Son of Israel to the places of studying Torah. In Ramini's view, Hebrew is more than a language. It's a key to a social sphere in which the Jewish religion is safer. That is why he welcomes and praises every kind of work translated into Hebrew, even dramatic works, wishing to create a complete and separate bookshelf consisting of only Hebrew works. So, does this historical case of translating into a less spoken language have anything to do with our topic? I leave it to our panelists to decide. To finish this more boring part of the event, which did not include Yiddish or Harry Potter, here is the basilisk from Leon Modina's 1610 Tzemach Tzadik. Just don't look at him straight in the eye. Agoy Sedan.
Thank you very much, Ovia, for this wonderful talk. And I think that it's very exciting to think about the change of the ethos between Hebrew and Yiddish. I mean, a lot of things that you said were about Hebrew, and right now we think about the same things considering Yiddish. And I hope that we will open this topic in the discussion right now, because right now I'm excited to turn to the translator himself, Arun Viswanath, and also it's once again a great opportunity to remind you all that you can buy the book. You have a link in the chat. So Arun, thank you so much for being with us.
Shalom Aleichem. Es ist sehr ein großes Covid zusammen du mit allen Chushewe Akademikers von JUTACT. Ich teile mit ein Biene. Ich allein bin nicht kein Akademiker, aber fort hoffe ich, als ich will etwas beitragen zum Schmiss. It's really great to be here. Thank you, JUTACT, for inviting me. This is such a cool event, and I'm excited for the conversation.
Thank you very much. We're excited too. So I think that maybe many people in the audience will be a little bit what you call in Yiddish chikave and want to ask questions as well. They're curious and want to ask questions as well. I'm not sure that we will have time, but if you have a question, you can write it in the chat and maybe we'll get to it. I cannot promise, but we will get to it. So so let us start. So in our research on early modern Jewish translations, we can point to a variety of reasons for translating a piece into a Jewish language, such as creating a dialogue between cultures, gatekeeping or controlling contents that one should or should not be exposed to, or even maintaining a community's tradition or ethos, as shown by Auvia in his talk. So does any of these reasons resonate with you? Or in other words, why did you decide to translate Harry Potter into Yiddish?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first and most honest answer is that it's really quite selfish. I grew up speaking Yiddish at home. Yiddish was one of my first two languages. The other one was Tamil, a language from South India. So that's a different story. But I came from a family of people involved with the Yiddish language and with the Yiddishist movement. Essentially, my family just never really stopped speaking Yiddish. And growing up in the suburbs of New York City, in Teaneck, New Jersey, and having access to a lot of really great children's and young adult literature in English, I was reading things like The Boxcar Children or Goosebumps or Harry Potter. And sure, there is a very rich tradition of Yiddish children's literature, but at least 5-year-old me, 10-year-old me, 15-year-old me did not really appreciate that literature. There were some ways in which the aesthetic and the ethos of that literature didn't really speak to me as a kid growing up in the 90s. And so I really wish that I had had something like Harry Potter in Yiddish. And when I married my wife and we talked about having kids in Yiddish one day, and I now, thank God, I have a 2-year-old daughter, Kanahara. She asked me if I really wanted to raise our children in a world where there isn't Harry Potter in Yiddish. She's actually the really big Harry Potter fan. So yeah, so that's what got me started on the project. And also growing up in the Yiddish community, I mean, we can't just pretend that it's not a pretty small and niche community these days outside of the Hasidic community. And it's important for me to engage with Yiddish in a way that feels dynamic, that feels exploratory. And I think that as Osnat was mentioning, that Yiddish has a very long tradition of, and in fact, the way that the language was forged is in many ways deeply connected to that exploration and encountering the outside world. Yeah.
So so you mentioned your own family, yes, and thinking about like translating into Yiddish as a part of your own heritage in a way, but except from your children, who are your intended readers that you had in mind? Only Yiddishists, or maybe people that wanted to learn Yiddish, or because there's a difference between people that speak Yiddish and Yiddishists, is like yeah. Ideologically and
yes. So I mean, I guess like before diving into any specifics, my philosophy is kol dichvin. Anybody who is interested in Yiddish and excited about Yiddish Harry Potter, they should have it. If they just want to have it on their bookshelves because that makes them feel connected to their heritage, that's great too. Even if they never, read a word of Yiddish or learn Yiddish, I hope that they do. And there's certainly people who have seen the book as a bridge into the Yiddish language. People who either are huge fans of Harry Potter, and even though this is really not a beginner's text, I mean, sure, Harry Potter, it's young adult fiction, but that doesn't make it easy for a beginner to read. And yet at the same time, it's unbelievable how many people know this text by heart. And in many ways, that makes Yiddish Harry Potter almost, for some, an ideal pedagogical guide. So, of course, Yiddishists are the ones who are very near and dear to my heart. And as much as I was creating this in a way that is selfish for me, I'm also selfish for all Yiddishists. And there's a certain extent to which I think that it's important for the Hasidic world to have it, but that's perhaps a longer conversation.
And did you expect, or do you expect that there are going to be readers that will be exposed to Harry Potter for the first time through the Yiddish translation? Like the Harry Potter that they will have in their minds is the Yiddish one. I, for example, have the Hebrew one in my mind. So something like that will occur also with the Yiddish translation.
It's funny because I guess I was just talking about Hasidim. One might think that there is a whole segment of society who, now that there's Harry Potter in Yiddish, they're going to read it. But if you think about it, well, first of all, the borders of the Hasidic community are not quite as ironclad as we might think. They're quite porous. And the people who tend to be more open to, kfira and avodah zarah, all the corrupting aspects of the world of magic that is perhaps could be considered antithetical to traditional Judaism. They are often the ones who have already read it in English. And so while it's kind of romantic to think of this idea that it's this opening of Harry Potter to a whole group of people that have never seen it, that's probably not the case, although there are many Hasidim who I know are reading the book. I think it's perhaps more so Yiddishists who might not be that interested in Harry Potter, but are willing to read anything that's in Yiddish. And so some of my dear friends, in fact, one of my editors of the translation had never read Harry Potter before, so this was his first time being exposed to it. So I hope it made a good impression on him.
Yeah, I have to admit that before I started to read the translation, I thought, how would you able to translate the rhythm of J.K. Rowling into Yiddish? And I think you made a wonderful job. I felt like not only the Yiddish, but also like the J.K. Rowling rhythm in the translation. So maybe experience like Harry Potter the first time in your translating Yiddish is not a bad idea. I mean it's a very good translation. So in which cases did you try to keep the cultural atmosphere of the book close to that of the source? Meaning when we're talking about Harry Potter, so the cultural atmosphere is England, the 1990s or the late 1980s. There's a discussion with like Harry Potter nerds when exactly it occurs, but it's a specific atmosphere, and which is quite other than the atmosphere that you usually find in Yiddish literature. So in which cases you try to keep this atmosphere, and in which cases did you choose to refer to specific Yiddish cultural features?
Yeah, well, a very brief digression. Growing up in the 90s, I was basically reading Harry Potter around the same time that Harry Potter, as depicted in the books, was at that age. And my birthday was 2 days ago, and
oh, wow,
know that Harry Potter's birthday was 3 days ago, July 31st. And so I always felt like I had this yichus, somehow in a parallel way. But then I found out that actually it's set in the 80s, and the fact that he was a certain age at the time that I was reading it didn't really reflect that. So that was a big disappointment. But anyway, to your question, there are many ways in which Harry Potter is inextricably tied to British culture, to Christian culture. So, for example, everybody is celebrating Christmas and Easter. You know, I'm not going to go and change that to Hanukkah. I actually even had to learn what a Christmas cracker was and a flaming Christmas cake was. I had to do quite a bit of research outside of my cultural comfort zone to make sure that I was actually understanding these terms correctly. And then, you know, there's also ways in which Yiddish can and has been a cultural chameleon. Whatever country you're living in, that tends to be the terms of address that you're using. So in English-speaking Yiddish literature, people are, you know, tend to be referred to as Mr. and Mrs. When students are referring to the headmaster and to the teachers, or at least the male teachers, they say sir, and to the female teachers, they say madam. So those are the ways in which it is both part of the British culture, but not in a way that Yiddish is unable to reflect. At the same time, there are also aspects in which there are references that come up in the book that I didn't think that any of my readers would really know. There's a particularly salient scene when all of the letters start arriving from Hogwarts, and Uncle Vernon is going absolutely crazy, and he's hammering up the door, and it says in the book that he's leaning down with his hammer with nails in his mouth, and he's singing Tiptoe Through the Tulips. So I had to do a little bit of research, go on YouTube, figure out what in the world this song was. So it was clear that the picture that was being painted was this guy's, you know, completely gone crazy. And so instead of literally saying, you know, however you translate tiptoe through the tulips in Yiddish, instead I just picked a Yiddish children's song that would sound equally as absurd. So he's singing Habe Chapur Ochsen, which is the classic Yiddish children's repetition song. Yeah.
So now I'm starting to think about like the Yiddish version of Tiny Tim, the singer that's especially known for singing like the weird and disturbing version of Tiptoe Through the Tulips. I didn't remember it appears in the original. It appears in the original book. So, but now we have to have like the Yiddish Tiny Tim in a way. So as we know, in their work, translators, as you, not only face the task of translating a language, but also need to use different techniques in order to transmit cultural features, meaning special terms, associations. You mentioned one, but I get many more. So many times they use these techniques. They use techniques of domestication, or in our case, Judaization, as Osnat said, of materials. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you made the Yiddish version of Harry Potter a little bit more Yiddish? And please give us examples.
Yes, it would be my pleasure. So I hope maybe we can take 10 minutes just to go through a couple of examples. You can let me know if that works with our timeline.
Yes, that works
Awesome.
great.
So I'm gonna share my screen here and let's just see if this goes. So I'm sharing my screen and now I'm going to try to present. Do you see the presentation now? Loading.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, great. So the first example, which is sort of, I think, a halfway point in between completely Judaizing and leaving it alone is the term Quidditch. So as I'm sure probably all of our listeners know, except for those who are still holding out and haven't read any Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling is very expansive in her universe building, and there's all kinds of places and professions and sports. So Quidditch is the most popular sport that happens in the wizarding world. And I could have just translated the term as Quidditch. Honestly, it kind of sounds like a Yiddish word. But at the same time, it's precisely in those places where the author is doing that universe building, playing with language, playing with concepts, that there's a great opportunity to figure out, okay, what are the ways in which this could feel more Hamish, like more familiar, culturally familiar to the readers. So what occurred to me was Quidditch is a game that's played while flying on a broom, and you're supposed to shoot balls into hoops. And so it occurred to me that there's this saying, which I first encountered in the poetry of Itzik Manger, "As Gott will shista bezem." I don't know if this saying is still current in modern Hebrew, but if God wills it, even a broom can shoot, maybe sprout, depending on what you think the etymology there is. But it occurred to me that we have this saying, which essentially means if basically anything is possible, which in many ways is the ethos of the Harry Potter universe. And so I thought, okay, I gotta use this saying. It would be a crime if I didn't. If I didn't, people would ask me, why didn't I? And so I kind of just mushed it together, and I got shees, which means to shoot, and Besen, which means a broom, and all together we get shees Besen. So in Yiddish Harry Potter, people play not Quidditch, but shees Besen. This, I would say, is probably one of the rare places where I didn't have to Judaize it. I could have just done Quidditch, but I felt compelled by some spirit. There are other cases where the author is playing with language in other ways, waxing poetic, breaking out of that sort of the prose of the idiom that dominates the narrative. And there's quite a few poems and songs within the book. So I thought I would read the song of the Sortierhit, the sorting hat. I'm going to read it in my Ukrainian Yiddish dialect, but we're going to have the text both in English. So this is not the translation of the Yiddish, but the original on the left, and then the Yiddish on the right. And as I think you will see, some perhaps more than others, the words are not translated literally, but rather there are certain cultural concepts that I had the occasion to insert here. Okay, so here we go. I'm just going to read it in Yiddish, so hopefully you can follow along. Oh, sorry, I should mention what the sorting hat is. For those of you who do not know, the sorting hat is a magical hat that you put on upon your matriculation within the Hogwarts School of Woodcraft and Wizardry, which determines for you which of the 4 houses you're going to be in. Gryffindor, Slytherin, Hufflepuff, and Ravenclaw. Okay, here we go. Siz man punim nish kin Schönheit, no de Schenkeit gun nish sucht. Geh gefinn mi noch a Hittel, das a Kopf wie Mansfam. Hey, die Ketschme, Kitschme, Kapelich, die Streime Leusgepitzte. Seid Meuchel. Ich bin das des Samme Kimzenitzte. Der Hogwarts sortierhet, weist an Ätzem in dan Kerden, Tom mest me gewoon in Hemme Venus, wem die Ties geher. It's a golden griff, that's the translation for Gryffindor. Geherden die mit Harz galant in Dresd. Sie tellen sich heus mit Gewehre, und das was Gewehre heißt. Geherst die wieder Hufflepuff, den Joischerholz die Teile. Mats ne stoiste Horavanje in beständiger Getreide. Baschert zu sein in Robbenkrell, that's Ravenclaw, ist der mit scharfen Sinnen, die Unhängers von Wissen in von Klickschaft sich gefunden. Sie äfsche treffst die echte Freund in Samderen den Chitren, that's Slytherin. Wir bieten Ziel der Grechen sind in Kuscher alle Mitteln. Fatima Chunit, schreck sich nicht, ich leg auf dir keine Hand. Ich bin fort, bloß sortiert, gura freundlich Stück gewandt. So as I hope you had the occasion to see as well, there are myriad opportunities to bring in aspects of Jewish culture in ways that keep it within the frame of the song and don't really mess with the plot. And I think the final example that I'll bring here, what we were just talking about, you just heard the translations of some of the names of the Hogwarts houses. And one of those is Samdrin. So, okay, why not Slytherin? Obviously, Slytherin in English has that pesky sound, which Yiddish and Hebrew, of course, don't have. So, I could have gone with Slytherin or Slytherin, something like that. But of course, Slytherin itself in English is a play on words. It is meant to evoke the slithering of a snake, which is, of course, the mascot of wily old Slytherin. And so I had to get to thinking, what are some of the other concepts in Yiddish, not necessarily culturally, but just in terms of its vocabulary, that I could use to evoke the same feeling? And I realized, oh, okay, sam in Yiddish means venom. I know that I've made this mistake many times in speaking Hebrew. In Hebrew, if I understand correctly, sam means like a drug. In Yiddish, sam means venom. And therein, direct cognate with English, meaning therein. And so samderin, which is close enough and kind of matches the rhythm of Slytherin, and basically means something like there is venom inside, which of course is, I think, appropriate for Slytherin. So these are some examples where you can kind of play with the cultural aspects, you can play with the letters. I think there was maybe one other aspect that I wanted to bring. Roni, I hope we have time because I think this was a really fun one. The mirror of Erized. This is an object that Harry encounters, I believe in chapter 12, where he looks into the mirror, and it's this mirror that shows not yourself, but it shows your deepest desires. And if you look on the engraving on the top of the mirror, it has this text which looks like gibberish. I'm not going to try to read it, but if you turn it backwards, it becomes legible. I show not your face, but your heart's desire. And so, well, the first thing that I did was, okay, I just translated, I show not your face, but your heart's desire. Then I turned it backwards. Okay, voila, gibberish. That's fine. But then I realized something interesting. There were a lot of alepphs in the sentence that I had translated. So yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 alepphs. And I thought, okay, wouldn't it be interesting if I could take advantage of the fact that in Yiddish, when you want to say that something is gibberish, you say, this is Tagenlushn, meaning, oh, this is Aramaic, from the Aramaic translation of the Tanakh. Wouldn't it be fun if this gibberish could look kind of like Aramaic? And so I'm not going to try to read it, but I just ended up segmenting it in ways that makes it kind of look kind of Semitic, kind of like Aramaic, and rather conveniently, I think, this scans pretty closely to a lot of the piyutim that are quite common in Jewish communities, like B'nai Chala or Asaders, Askinu Sudasa. So anyway, I thought that was really fun. I think those are all the examples that I brought to present, but we can dig into more verbally if you'd like.
Oh, so you said a lot of times, like during the examples that you gave, you said play and fun, and you also like talked about like the playfulness of translation in a way, and maybe even more with like translating into a language like Yiddish, when some of the readers are like Yiddishists that know not only the language itself, but also like its all connotations and associations. And that leads me to another question. Were you concerned that translation might create a too Jewish or a too Städte-like Harry Potter?
Yeah, this is pretty funny because this is actually where I got a lot of flack in terms of the popular response to the book, where people said, it should have been more Jewish. Come on, it should be Herschel Teppet. It should be, it should be, the spell should be in Aramaic. The Gemara has so many spells in Aramaic. Why didn't you do that? So, I mean, I think my base response to that is, I'm sorry, I'm not doing fan fiction. But I think that there's something a little bit more deep just in terms of the philosophy of translation. Perhaps Yiddish is actually one of the traditions of translation which has played a little bit more fast and loose with this. But I generally try to avoid changing the content of the plot, and instead really tried to focus on the medium, because you were picking on the playfulness piece. Yiddish has the capacity to be playful in many ways, and Yiddish is also incredibly diverse on a lot of axes. And one of those that it seemed like it would be a crime to gloss over is the diversity of dialects and registers that Yiddish has. And in many ways, I think this is arguably perhaps one of the most major features in the way that Yiddish figures in the popular Jewish imagination, where we have these, I think, mostly playful feuds between speakers of different dialects. There's the classic skit, I'm a Litvak, she's a Galitz. People have stories of my parents stopped speaking Yiddish because one of them was a Litvak and one of them was a Galician, and they decided, forget about it. We're going to speak in English. We're going to speak in Hebrew. But you know, all of that goes to say that dialect is a very inherent piece of that. And so that was an avenue in which I felt like I could really almost try to superimpose Harry Potter onto that, or perhaps superimpose that onto Harry Potter in a way that that felt not too intrusive, but also felt very Yiddish. And so, not to dive too much into details here, but anybody familiar with the caricatures and the stereotypes that are associated with the various dialects and registers of Yiddish can perhaps appreciate that Hagrid is through and through a Galician, that he is a Polish Yid. He is warm. He is, I hope nobody takes this personally, perhaps, you know, joking, bumbling, backcountry. Again, I'm drawing on caricatures. Whereas somebody like Snape or McGonagall or even Filch in certain ways is much more of a Litvak. They're more buttoned up. They're severe. They're very measured. And there are plenty of ways to reflect that in the text in terms of the vocabulary that they use. I tried to also reflect their mode of pronunciation, which is perhaps the most salient pieces of dialect. And then the final example that I would give in terms of the register is I had Dumbledore speaking with a much more Lushan Kodesh enriched register. So he was speaking with a lot more Hebrew and Aramaic, which is something that would have been typical and today is arguably still typical of those who are much more fatifed, much more deeply involved with Jewish texts and Jewish religious life. You could argue that by having these people speak these languages, I've made them Jewish, and they're no longer part. It's sort of gone outside. It's gone outside of the acceptable bounds of the Potterverse. But I'd like to think that, to the extent that I really tried to make these almost more like caricatures and more of the medium and less of the content, and limiting it to certain characters, that ended up creating a sort of effect where it's less of a one-to-one map between some sort of imagined shtetl in the Potterverse and more of an infusion of Jewish or Yiddish feeling in a way that doesn't interfere too much. So the reader will be the judge of that.
So I have tons of like nerdy questions only concerning like the dialects themselves, but we're running out of time. So I will use my power as a moderator and ask one last question before we move on. So, as we learned from Osnat Sharon Pinto's talk, fascination with fantasy and magic goes back a long way in Jewish literature. Your publisher, Olniansky Publishing, but you can, of course, get into the website and buy the book if you like, also published a Yiddish translation of J.R.R. Tolkien, Der Hobbit. So as a Yiddishist and as a translator, why do you think that there is this tendency to translate fantasy specifically into Yiddish? Is there some affinity between fantasy readers and Yiddish readers?
That's a good question. I think that just taking fantasy as a genre in and of itself, and I'm not speaking as any sort of credentialed literary critic, I think there's a sense in which fantasy literature as a genre has a sort of eternal appeal. People can read it without necessarily being familiar with the cultural milieu, precisely because there is no cultural milieu. Everybody's new to it, and you can kind of read anything into it or out of it, and that makes it feel very universal. So that's what I would say about the genre of fantasy. Of course, for the genre of Yiddish translation, as I was saying earlier, I think that there is a very long tradition of encountering the unfamiliar and exploring that, and I think that that's probably something that the tradition of Yiddish translation and fantasy literature have in common. But perhaps there's also something deeper beyond just that, Yiddishists and fantasy fans are nerds, which is that in the same sociological and political milieu that gave rise not just to Yiddishism, but to Hebraism and socialism and territorialism and all of these isms that arose in the beginning of the 20th century. I think there is something to be said about Yiddishism and today's world, which is really involved with Yiddish, that there's an aspect of imagination there. There's an imagine of seeing the world, and perhaps even just being Jews. There's an aspect of seeing the world as it could be, and being really kind of motivated by that, and shepen chiyas, like to kind of like draw energy from that. And so I think that maybe I'm just making something up there, but that's definitely something that I've sensed. And I hope that anybody who is interested in exploring their own heritage and interested in engaging with Yiddish will buy the book as well. Hashtag buy it for Bubby. I think it's a great present. Even people who don't read the book or don't know any Yiddish seem to really love having it on their bookshelves. People love bragging that they have Yiddish Harry Potter. So I would definitely encourage everybody who's listening, if you're moved, please do buy the book.
So Sheinem Dank, and I really liked your last answer because it connects us really good to our last section of this evening. And now we will turn to Mr. Dor Saarman. Dor is a PhD student in the School of Jewish Studies and Archaeology at Tel Aviv University. His dissertation deals with the sources of knowledge of Rabbi Yishaya Horovitz, Ashla, in his book Shnei Luchot HaBrit. And Dor is also the co-writer and the co-host of the extremely popular, and I have to say awesome, podcast, the podcast which must not be named, ההסכת שאין לומר את שמו, with Shir Reuven, which is dedicated to Harry Potter, and especially the experience of rereading Harry Potter at your 20s or 30s. And I think that right now you're in your 7th season, meaning you're reading the 7th book, so it's the last season, unfortunately, but I hope that there will be maybe other seasons as well. So Dor will give us a short comment to this entire evening, and the thing that he would like to emphasize, as he said to me, is there any Jewishness in Harry Potter himself? So Dor, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. And hello, everyone. To start my summary of our evening, I want to begin with a conundrum that's been bothering me for at least a year, and which came into sharp relief ahead of this event. Why do we wish to continue discussing the Harry Potter series? It sometimes seems that two opposite forces should converge to prevent this discourse. On one hand, it has been only 25 years since the first book in the series was published. In the lectures we have just heard today, and the topics in which we deal, we're used to going back 400 or 500 years, whereas a mere 25 years isn't considered a sufficient historical perspective through which to examine the phenomenon detached to our own present. On the other hand, while the series itself concluded in 2007, I think, the Harry Potter franchise lives on, prequel films keep getting released, and it seems that as long as Rowling lives, we should continue to receive expansions and updates published under her watchful eye. And yet, it seems that despite the short time that has passed, the world won't stop discussing Harry Potter and analyzing this work. The podcast that must not be named, which I write and co-host with my partner Shir Reuven, may have become a minor sensation in Israel, but it is a part of a worldwide trend. Every week there are podcast episodes all around the world devoted to Harry Potter, thousands of discussions in Facebook groups and forums, fan theories, YouTube videos analyzing the work, and even academic discussions like the one taking place right here. So we have a relatively new cultural work, but one that is discussed incessantly, which raised the difficulty, how can I summarize such an evening? Therefore, I thought that in light of our collective work in the field of Jewish history, which has brought us all together tonight, perhaps it would be proper to ask, is there anything Jewish in the Potterverse? Can any motives be pointed out that made it popular in Israeli society specifically, regardless of its worldwide popularity? And I do not mean motives like the existence of a Jewish student named Anthony Goldstein, or the clear analogy of Voldemort and his supporters to the Nazis. I'm not talking about something like that, because there was something else in Harry Potter that has occupied my mind quite a bit over the past 2 years. In a conversation in the podcast, which we had with the Israeli journalist Akiva Novik, Akiva is affiliated to the modern Orthodox sector, or religious Zionism, if you want. And we asked Akiva about something we noticed, the attraction of more than a few, let's say, observant Jews to the Harry Potter series, in Israel at least. The enthusiasm of religious Jews for Harry Potter seems unusual because they did not take part in the craze for any other global pop phenomenon like Harry Potter. And Akiva offered an interesting explanation. Harry Potter and his friends seems at times like Jewish youth from the shtetl, as opposed to characters like the Malfoy family, who are reminiscent of rich Jew-hating Gentiles, or the characters like Crabbe and Goyle, who are nothing but a strong, bullied, stupid Gentile characters. Harry and his group don't rely on their physical strength or their wealth, but on a sort of a combination of knowledge, some luck, and a lot of pluck. And also Harry's appearances, a thin boy with glasses and tousled black hair, is also more consistent with the Jewish image from the Ashkenazi diaspora, as opposed to, let's say, more European Christian looking protagonist. Yes. And if we delve into deeper layers in the books, we can find, I think, some interesting analogies to the Jewish or Jewish-Israeli world, which we cannot know if Rowling intended or whether they are a product of our own mental associations, but either way, they exist. Let's talk about, for example, Lord Voldemort, the main villain. As if you read the books, you know Lord Voldemort divided his soul into in a destructive process into 7 different parts, each one called the Horcrux. In the last book, we learned the way to negate the effect of the Horcrux and return the soul fragment within it into the original body. The person who performed the Horcrux ritual must feel deep remorse for what they've done. Remorse, of course, is a crucial part of the Jewish process of repentance. The penitent must feel deep remorse, leave behind the world of sin in which they were mirrored, and understand the destructive impact of their actions. The key to correction, to the tikkun, and the new slate is always rooted in remorse. And Jewish guidebooks in tradition of the Musar literature has been written on how to feel true remorse and repeat and return to Hashem's work. Now, Lord Voldemort's patent inability to feel even a flicker of remorse makes him therefore not only very far from the Jewish concept of repentance, but to a certain degree, it makes him, I would say, anti-Jewish. Voldemort's contempt for anyone not of pure blood like himself, which is, of course, is an analogy to the Nazi contempt toward Jews, allows us to say that from a values point of view, one may say that Voldemort despises values deeply embedded in the Jewish culture. Now, another point, more relevant to Israeli reality than Jewish history, can be found in the second book, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Arun, you can think how to translate it to Yiddish already. The main plot of the second volume entails a mysterious monster causing the students to turn into stone statues. And it is unclear who the student operating the monster. The student is known only as the heir of Slytherin. Then a social crisis develops among the students. Some suspect Harry himself of being the heir of Slytherin. But beyond such suspicious or others, immense resentment builds up between the majority of the student body and those belonging to the House of Slytherin. In fact, despite it being clear at this point in the book that the Slytherins are the bad guys in the story, Lord Voldemort was part of the Slytherin house. They're racist, yes, but even though distinctions develop towards any student who might be affiliated with Slytherin, including Harry himself, the description is one of a society which, under a threat of terrorism, loses its solidarity. This reminded me of the Israelis' reactions to the terror attacks during the second Intifada war in the start of the 21st century, 20 years ago. This was not a time of solidarity, but one of immense suspicion towards the other, a time of turning to political extremism and the desire of many Israelis for a strong leader to impose order on the chaos. The chaotic situation is reminiscent, if we stretch it in a bit, not just to the terror attacks in the turn of the century, but perhaps even of Jewish existence in the ghettos during the Holocaust. And under this threat, the Jews were still subject to countless internal divisions, including accusations against specific individuals or collaboration with the Germans. If you will, the operating, the heir of Slytherin, yes, but perhaps to give us the moral lesson that it could never have been the fault of any Jew in the ghetto, even if they joined the Judenrat or became a capo. Rowling makes it clear to us in the second book, in the end of the second book, spoiler alert, the entire operation of the horrid monster was not the work of any students. It was actually again, Lord Voldemort himself, without any student to be guilty, not even students from Slytherin. So, of course, any Jew can be blamed in collaboration during the Holocaust. One may say. I'm getting close to the end. Now, throughout the rereading of the series and the work on the podcast, I found more and more parallels to Jewish history or Israeli reality that I don't have time to talk about, unfortunately. But I ask myself, of course, many times, did Rowling intend all these parallels fully? It is hard to say, because the series, of course, is successful worldwide, and its popularity in Israel is neither unusual or exceptional. But the most important thing, which I believe underscores this conference as well, is how relevant the series can be to its audience from different angles. The high relevance of the Harry Potter series to our lives is what encouraged its translation to Yiddish, in honor of which we have assembled here tonight. If Harry Potter is an epic tale that can be relevant to Jews living in Israel and in somewhat reminiscent to Jewish Ashkenazi past, then why shouldn't it be translated into Yiddish? In the end, it should be noted that my own reading experience of Harry Potter in my childhood did not take place in the original English language, but of course in the Hebrew translation by the superb translator, Gili Bar-Hillel. And to the end, I want to give you an excellent example of Gili Bar-Hillel's cultural localization is when she has the despicable minister of magic, Cornelius Fudge. It was in the 5th book. She put in his mouth, she uses the Yiddish origin word, Meidele. When Fudge addresses to a female student, he called her Meidele. Now, the adult Israeli reader recognize the chauvinism here associated with the past Israeli politician and past president Ezer Weizmann, who used the term to belittle women. He always called women Maidele. This is but a small example how within the Hebrew translation, Yiddish suddenly peeked through into Harry Potter's world, sharpening the typecasting of a character for us, making the entire plot more relevant to us. That being said, all that is left to offer is a blessing upon the new and excellent translation of the first volume into Yiddish, and to hope that we live to see full translation for the entire series and all attendant content products to come. Thank you very much. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Ronnie.
Mirza Hashem. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes. And if I may ask Aaron a question.
Yes.
If we have time, one last question. Aaron, when you read Harry Potter, did you come to the same conclusion? I mean, there are, of course, as you said, many Christian and British culture in Harry Potter, but did you find in the original, I mean, something Jewish when you read it? You can say no, of course. No, it's also a good question.
I mean,
good answer.
To the extent that so much of the Jewish world consists of and is also defined by boundaries and oppositions, there's plenty of those to be found within the book. I think perhaps the one personal anecdote that I can share is that my wife, whose father grew up in Switzerland, his father, my wife's grandfather was the rabbi of Basel for many years. And after he finished reading the Harry Potter series, he said, "Amazing, how did Rowling know what it was like to grow up as a Jew in Switzerland?" And so, I think there are so many ways in which you could read Jews into it, whether it's the opposition between muggles and wizards or good and evil within the wizarding world, or of course, if you're looking to cause trouble, perhaps the ever anti-Semitic caricature of the goblins, which Rowling didn't make up, but I suppose did perpetrate. So yes, definitely, there's many ways.
So thank you so much, and thank you, Arun, and thank you, Dor and Osnat and Auvia. One thing that Dor that you said that was pretty complicated is you mentioned details from the later books, and we read only the first book because we read Harry Potter only in Yiddish.
Only in Yiddish.
This is why we have to make another conversation after the translation of the second book will be complete. We have Nayas, yes, Arun, you said that the second book title will be Harry Potter und die Kammer von Seudes. So we have a lot to expect. So seid gesund, alle men, and I really hope that to see you in our other activities. Of course, you have some information in the chat about the Jutact activities and about how to buy the book. And we hope to see you again in other Treffungen, other events related to Harry Potter, early modern Jewish translations and culture in general. So thank you so much.
Großen Dank. תודה רבה לכולם.
Sei gesund, gute Nacht.
Sei gesund.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Seid gesund.
Thank you.